so wonderful is your unfailing love. Your cross has spoken mercy over me, over me. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no heart could fully know how glorious, how beautiful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Powerful, so powerful, your glory fills the skies, your mighty works displayed for all to see, all to see. The beauty of your majesty awakes my heart to sing. How marvelous, how wonderful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with its love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with this love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love, from above, came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face. And Jesus is his name. Faithful love is a friend just when hope seems to end. Welcome face, sweet embrace, tender touch filled with grace. Faithful love, endless power, living flame, spirit's fire, burning bright in the night, guiding my way. Faithful love, from above, came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the
All right, welcome back, everyone, as this week we turn our attention to Psalm 44, another of the Psalms that mention the sons of Korah in the superscription. We talked about that in the introduction to Psalm 42. You recall 42 and 43 kind of went together. 44, another with a similar superscription, so we won't go over that again. Also, as you look at Psalm 44 at kind of a high level, you see as we also discussed with 42 and 43 as we came into the second book within the book of Psalms, the section that we're coming into that are sometimes called the Elohist Psalms, because of the vocabulary they tend to use. You have Elohim for God rather than God's covenant name, as you had predominantly in the first part of Psalms. So you tend to see in these Psalms God with a capital G rather than the all caps Lord that we've been seeing. And again, as we noted, it isn't 100% one or the other in either case. But it is a striking difference, perhaps like a 90-10 split, with Lord in the first part, with God in the second, even though you see both terms throughout both. So we have those things that are still relatively new, that we just picked up with Psalms 42 and 43. Now at the high level, two things kind of jump out to me about Psalm 44. One is, now as we have with most of the Psalms, if you ask the question, when exactly was this written, on what occasion, it may come as no shock to you by now that we don't know. It isn't captured. We don't have a definitive statement that tells us exactly when and why it was written, but there are a number of very obvious clues, to me at least, that seem to suggest that this is a psalm from the exile or perhaps after. Different people think different things. You have a number of commentators out there who will doggedly insist that virtually every psalm is by David during David's own lifetime, unless there's something, explicitly that would suggest otherwise. I don't personally think that fits at all here. As I kind of read through this, it kind of stood out to me rather obviously that this is a later psalm having to do with the Israelites' exile. Again, because of their sin, their refusal to repent. You recall the northern kingdom first falling to Assyria, then later on, some 100-odd years, 120 thereabouts, you have, or no longer than that, 100 and, let me think, if I do my math correctly, 160, 170 plus. The southern kingdom of Judah falling to Babylon, going into the exile. You recall the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah, who himself lived contemporaneously to those events. So yeah, I think that's the case, and I think as we go through, perhaps those things will stand out to you as well. Another thing that stands out a bit about Psalm 44 as you're reading through it, you'll notice there's a New Testament, or there's a verse in this psalm quoted in the New Testament by Paul in his epistle to the Romans. So as you're kind of reading through, if you're like me, you'll read through and then you'll come across a sentence and think, this sounds so familiar to me. Where have I heard this before? Sometimes it's one that's particularly well known, like it is here, and the reference will just kind of immediately jump to mind. Otherwise, it's sometimes a little harder to place, a little more obscure of a reference. But we do have that here as well. So, before we get started kind of working through the psalm, this one falls very neatly out into four very distinct parts, right? If you're into outlining things, trying to kind of follow the flow of thoughts, looking for the big chunks of thought, this one is easy. It's not terribly difficult to see. And as I sat down and we were about to start the recording, I have the breakdown here in the JPS to not version, and I was going to refer to that, but then I remembered at the last second, wait a minute, the numbering is different. Sometimes the verse numbers there's a difference between that version and the King James and others that we're more familiar with. So I'll go to Brother Waycaster because he has the exact same. I mean, like I said, it's obvious, the breakdown here, the 4 parts. But of course, his will have the verse numbers that match what I'm sure you're looking at. So it starts out, the first 8 verses, the psalmist reflects upon God's help in times past. So he reflects upon the times when God has delivered His people, helped His people. It continues on in the next part. They go so the psalmist goes from reflecting upon God's deliverance in the past to reflecting upon the current situation. So you go from past to present, which is clearly an extremely trying and difficult time. Again, in my own estimation, rather obviously alluding to the Israelites' period of exile. And then the next part, 17 to 22. You have the psalmist declaring the innocence of God's people. Personally, and again, as we work through in just a minute, maybe you'll see this too. It almost feels to me a little bit like Job kind of coming right up to the line, of perhaps overstating things and maybe going a bit too far in protesting, his situation and what may or may not be, God's place either in causing it or from his perspective, failing to alleviate it. I almost get a little bit of that here as well, but again, not to the extent that I think they do cross the line. But definitely, the psalmist is like Job, insistent. I'm suffering, yes, but I'm innocent, I'm righteous, we're still your people, that sort of a thing, and we'll come to it. And then you have the final part. You have a prayer, the way the JPS outline puts it, a petition. In fact, I like the way they word it here in the Tanakh commentary. It says this is a community petition. So again, the psalmist writing on behalf of the people, Israelites. A community petition begins with a hymn about God's past deliverance, followed by a complaint about the current situation, a protestation of innocence, and then it concludes with the petition itself. So after reflecting upon God's help in times past, the lack of God's help in their current situation, the psalmist's insistence that they are still His people, that there's still something worth redeeming there. It then ultimately concludes with this prayer, this request that they make of God. Okay, so starting out, he says, "We have heard with our ears, O God. Our fathers have told us what work Thou didst in their days, in the times of old." So hearkening way back into the distant mists of time, thinking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so going back. "How Thou didst drive out the heathen with Thy hand, and plantest them, how Thou didst afflict the people and cast them out." Okay, so again, thinking all the way back to the initial promise made to Abraham, God's dealings with Moses, leading the people out of Egypt through the wilderness, ultimately driving the native Canaanites out of the promised land and establishing his people there. Verse 3, "For they got not the land in possession by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them. But Thy right hand and Thine arm and the light of Thy countenance, because Thou hadst a favor unto them." Right, because God chose them. You may think of Jericho, right? The miraculous manner in which that initial city fell as the Israelites crossed over Jordan, came and conquered the land. Clearly not their own doing. It also brings to mind what we discussed in a sermon just 2 or 3 weeks back. Those stones that they took from the River Jordan, and they built this memorial, right? One smooth stone from the middle of the river to symbolize each of the tribes, so that in years to come, when their children ask, what do these stones mean, you can tell them, how God had delivered them. God had brought them across Jordan on dry ground and into the promised land. So we have the psalmist reflecting upon these very things. Again, if this is written when I think it's written centuries after the fact, nearly a millennia. Thou art my king, O God, command deliverances for Jacob. Through thee will we push down our enemies, through thy name will we tread them under that rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, thou hast put them to shame that hated us. Again, time after time, you go back and read Old Testament history up to this point in time. In God we boast all the day long and praise thy name forever. Okay, so positive note, right? The psalmist thinks back about all these times God has been there for his people. He drove the wicked people out of the land, established his people in it, and he has been there for them ever since. But you'll notice, starting in verse 9, a rather sharp change in not only in time, right? Because he goes from talking about the past to now talking about the present situation, but in tone as well. It goes from being very obviously positive about what God had done for his people in the past to now, again, a lack of that type of help and deliverance now. Verse 9, but thou hast cast off and put us to shame, and goest not forth with our armies. Thou makest us to turn back from the enemy, and they which hate us spoil for themselves. Thou hast given us like sheep appointed for meat, and hast scattered us among the heathen. And it's for me personally, that one phrase at the end of verse 11, more than anything else, suggests to me the exile, that they've been scattered among the heathen, right, after having been established and delivered time after time in the promised land. And again, as I said at the outset, others disagree, but I think it's rather obvious. They're in a terrible situation. They're as he says in verse 11, given like sheep appointed for meat, scattered among the heathen. Thou sellest thy people for naught, dost not increase thy wealth by their price. Thou makest a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and a derision to them that are round about us. Thou makest us a byword among the heathen, a shaking of head among the people. Right? So their situation, whenever this is being written, is so terrible. They are so cast down and so oppressed and dejected that they are amongst the people around them. So again, potentially Babylonians and the other nations round about who are seeing what's happening. They have become, as he puts it, a byword among the heathen, a shaking of head among the people. They're the example, right? When something comes to mind, you want to describe, someone who's at their lowest point, who has made the worst possible decisions, who's just an absolute mess, and you're thinking, who can I possibly hold up as the epitome, as the example, to communicate to someone else? You don't want to be like this person, right? I suppose any number of people may come to mind, real or fictitious, but they're the example. They're the poster child. This is what you don't want to happen to you. And the psalmist says that's exactly what God's people have become. They became a byword among the heathen. In other words, their name is mud. It's if you think about people who were the lowest of the low, Israelite is the word that comes to mind. A shaking of the head among the people, just the worst case. My confusion is continually before me; the shame of my face hath covered me. For the voice of him that reproacheth and blasphemeth, by reason of the enemy and avenger. All this has come upon us. Yet have we not forgotten. Okay, so I guess we're about to shift the gears again. So before we do so, in the past God has delivered them. Now it seems that God has just cast them off and utterly forgotten them. Not only is he not helping them in a positive sense to give them blessings, he's not helping them at all. He has left them to rot, so to speak. amongst the heathen, scattered amongst their enemies, to the point that they are just the lowest of the low. Ridicule and shame to everyone. Again, this is the exile. I can think of no other time in their history that fits as perfectly as that. Now, again, he's about to shift gears again, because here, this is where I was talking about how, to me, it almost sounds a little bit like Job. The psalmist is going to protest the innocence of the people, almost to the point, it seems to me, as if, we don't deserve what we're getting, or why would God do this to us when we don't deserve it? Again, he doesn't quite reach that point. In fact, I would say perhaps a good point of comparison here might be Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9, where you find Daniel praying on behalf of the nation. On the one hand, he acknowledges, yes, your people have been terrible, they deserve, and of course Daniel, there in Daniel 9, it's all within the context of that 70-year exile prophecy as well. And I guess not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but with something only tangentially related. But Daniel is grappling with a similar question. The people have come back from the exile. They've come back into the promised land. Why are they still suffering? But it's similar in that on the one hand, he's able to acknowledge that the people had it coming, while at the same time, kind of like you found the psalmist here doing, putting forward the notion that, yes, your people haven't always been what they should have been, but there is yet something good here. There is something worth redeeming. We're still your people, and that's similar to what you find here. So back up in 17, he says, "All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant." There are some. So I mentioned Daniel 9. I might also mention Revelation 3:4. You have there amongst the letters to the churches in Asia, the church at Sardis, like most of them, has problems. But he specifically says regarding Christians at Sardis that there are some there who have not yet soiled their garments, if I recall the metaphor correctly. And it comes back to something you find in the Old Testament time and time again, including in this very psalm, the notion of the righteous remnant. In a lot of the prophetic writings, the prophets speak of the remnant that's ultimately going to come out of captivity back into the land, so that scheme of redemption, which culminates in the New Testament and in Christ, can continue to play out as God intended. But this idea that even when God's people find themselves in these times where they've gone completely off the rails, to the extent that God's wrath is turned upon them, and they find themselves ultimately, in the worst case, in exile in Babylon, there's still that tiny number that remain faithful, even then. And I think that's what you have pictured here. The righteous remnant. There are some suffering this punishment that the psalmist is talking about, seemingly, from their perspective, having been just cast off and rejected by God, but they're still there, they're still faithful, even if they're in the minority. Again, Revelation 3:4, one example, in numerous places in the writing prophets, Daniel 9, an example. It reminds me also, you recall in Jeremiah, you have Jeremiah being asked a question similar to what Abraham had posed to God back in Genesis regarding Sodom and Gomorrah. Go out into the city, into Jerusalem, and see if you can find X number of righteous people. Right? You go out and search the city, you don't find any at all. It's clearly hyperbole, because if nothing else, Jeremiah himself is such a person. So this idea of the righteous few, even when the vast majority of the people have gone wrong. All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. Is he speaking on behalf of all Israel? Well, he can't be. Again, certainly if this is the exile, because again, they had it coming. They did deal falsely in the covenant. They didn't keep it. But there were those few there that did, that continued to keep the faith. Verse 18, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons and covered us with the shadow of death. Similar thought, the King James renders this, broken us in the place of dragons. The JPS Tanakh version renders it a bit differently. It has where the sea monster is, kind of like Leviathan in Job. I think that's a reference back to the days before creation, when God has brought order and stability to things. In other words, they've gone back to a place of chaos. Where everything is upside down, nothing is right. I believe that's what it means when he says you've sore broken us in the place of dragons. It's an allusion to the chaos that existed before God brought order to the world. If we have, and again, that's based upon the rendering in the Tanakh and the commentary there. If we have forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. Right? Similar, just a couple Psalms back, 38 if I'm not mistaken, but I may be. The idea that the psalmist is bringing forth his record. Lo, in the book it is written of me. Right? His own life story. Look, I lay it there. I am what I claim to be. Faithful, righteous, innocent. Look at the record of my life. Psalmist is saying the same thing here. Look, if we have turned away from God, if we've turned to idols, again, as many other fellow countrymen had, God would know. Right? He knows the secrets of the heart, even if it's stuff that they haven't done outwardly that other fellow humans could see. God would still know. But he says, look, we haven't done this. God knows, because he knows the secret things that others don't. And in verse 22, this is the verse that's quoted by Paul, Romans 8:36. Yea, for thy sake are we killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. And Paul uses it in Romans in a similar sense to what it's meant here. That sometimes the righteous suffer along with the unrighteous. That's how it was for the Israelites. It's how it is for Christians as well. You can do the right thing in life. You can be the kind of person God wants you to be, and yet you were still going to find suffering and persecution and struggles in this life. But again, the psalmist says that he is willing to endure it for the sake of righteousness, for staying true to God. Even though they're being punished, again, my take on this psalm, they're being punished in exile, in captivity, along with the 99% or what have you of their countrymen who brought it upon them all. I believe that's the idea here, and it certainly fits like a glove. Okay, so he wraps this up, and the psalm concludes the last couple of verses with the petition, right? With this prayer. Awake, why sleepest thou, O Lord? Arise, cast us not off forever. This is the psalmist's plea, again, on behalf of what I would say is the righteous remnant, those faithful few who, despite being innocent themselves, are suffering the punishment brought upon them by the people as a whole. And their plea is, Lord, don't let this go on forever. It's somewhat ironic. I've mentioned before to y'all in Habakkuk. Prophet Habakkuk, who's a contemporary of Jeremiah, he's living in just a few years before the southern kingdom falls to Judah. Right, like Jeremiah, he's contemporaneous with those events, with Nebuchadnezzar, the siege and fall of Jerusalem, etc. Habakkuk's question, his plea to God is essentially, as he looks and sees the wickedness of the Israelites, Habakkuk's question to God is, how long are you going to let this go on? How long is it going to be before you exact punishment and retribution on these wicked people? Of course, God's answer is, it's coming. Well, ultimately, he gives Habakkuk the same answer he gives Job, which is essentially, mind your own business and be quiet. I'm God and I do things my own way on my own timetable. But he does give him the answer. It is coming. It's coming in the form of Nebuchadnezzar to exact this punishment. Here, we have in Psalm 44, fast forward a couple of decades, have a psalmist asking a very similar question on the back end of this event, right? And his question is, Lord, how long are you going to let this go on? Right? Not the wickedness that needs to be punished, but the punishment that's come in the wake of that wickedness. To me, it almost seems as if it's coming full circle back to where Habakkuk began. It's like, okay, now this punishment has been enacted. You've punished the people, as you said you would, sending them into captivity. But there are still these few faithful here, the psalmist, evidently being among them, speaking on behalf of the group. How long is this? How long are we going to have to keep suffering for the sake of everyone else? Don't cast us off forever. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and forgettest our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. And of course, you and I, we're living long after the psalmist writing this. We know how it goes on. We know how it turns out. They are going to be redeemed, right? That righteous remnant is going to come out of captivity. They're going to come back to the promised land, and ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to come back. They're going to come back to the promised land, so that God's scheme of redemption for all men can continue to play out, culminating again in Christ. Which brings us back to Romans 8, and the fact that as Christians, we can express at times the very same notion that the psalmist does here. Right? Paul quotes this very verse, "For thy sake are we killed all the day long, we're counted as sheep for the slaughter," and applies it to Christians. So, here we have Psalm 44, a sentiment that, though it is very specific to a given point in Israel's history, whatever that point is, there's certainly thoughts and sentiments here that we as Christians can have, right? We live in this world. We're surrounded by wickedness every which way we turn. We as Christians strive to remain faithful to God, and yet, because we're in the midst of the wickedness, we ourselves oftentimes suffer for it. And so, going back, I guess, what would this be, 2,500 some odd years, 2,600, again, depending upon exactly when it was written, similar sentiments that we ourselves may sometimes have today. When it seems as if God has just left us to rot in the midst of all the people around us who were suffering, and you would say, well, they should be, they're wicked. Stay true anyway. And we might offer the very same prayer and petition that the psalmist does here. Having faith that in the long run, the outcome is going to be the same. It will not go on forever. And yes, God does redeem his people. So that's Psalm 44. Lord willing, next time we will continue on our way with Psalm 45. Thank you for your attention.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again, Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign